Hey everybody, happy last day of Web Summit. And I definitely came underdressed, I think, compared to these guys today. So I wanted to start off here with a quick question. Thinking about the role of algorithms and news, let's start off with this. Can I have you guys both answer, are algorithms a good or bad thing for journalism right now?
My own opinion is that they're a bad thing for journalism, mainly because of the mystery that surrounds them and the ignorance that publishers have about the way in which they work, and as a result, traffic suddenly collapsing for no explicable reason beyond a mysterious change in the algorithm. Our other fundamental objection to them, I think, is that they promote posts based on arbitrary signals like sharing, which strip stories of their context, their veracity, and their original sourcing. To give you an example for this week, I'm willing to wager that Donald Trump's face in a dog's ear was shared far more times than the Paradise Papers. Does that mean that Trump's face in a dog's ear is more important than the tax dodging revelations? No, but it's symptomatic of the way in which Facebook prioritizes content over what is actually significant. And Google, for its part, fails to highlight the hierarchy of content. So we and other newspapers can do the best exclusive stories that are at our disposal, and within minutes sometimes you can find that you're ranking on the story literally falling before your eyes. So the original hard work that you've done on the particular story means that somebody that's ripped the story off is far more likely to benefit from the traffic. Monetization doesn't seem to favor those big production stories.
It's got to be depressing to see.
Well, my answer would be a little bit of both. I think that if algorithms are used properly, they can be quite helpful for discovering journalism that you didn't know existed, that you actually are quite interested in. But that relies on the algorithms being built in a way that support good journalism and not, Trump dog ear stuff. So that is not a universally held approach. I think that it's really important to have the editors in charge of the algorithms. I think that large platforms, content platforms, should hire trained editors and journalists and should figure out how to marry journalistic principles to the algorithms so that they can surface high-quality journalism, which, by the way, a lot of people do want to see. And sometimes it's just hard to get to because the algorithms that you tend to see out there surface the link bait. And that's a shame. And I think that's harming our society. And further, these algorithms can also be readily gamed and even weaponized by state actors and trolls and other people that can do quite a bit of harm to our democracies and our economies.
Sure. So, Mike, a quick follow-up to that. So it's funny, the other day I think there's a story that said that you guys are the sleeping giant of online news, and then in a good way. I think it's a Mashable story. And I'm kind of curious because it seems like you guys are continuing to grow, and you've taken this approach of being both human-based but also adding in algorithms. I know there's been a lot of criticism by Facebook's gotten a lot of criticism for not having editors running their algorithms or for their news tab. So I'm kind of curious, what is it right now that has kind of helped you guys to be more at the forefront, like to this continued success, I guess? Like, what is it that you guys are doing with publishers that has kind of helped to increase the appetite of users, but also increase the appetite of publishers to lean into you guys?
Well, probably most importantly is that we've allied ourselves with the world's best publishers with the mission of helping to be a platform where great journalism can thrive. And there is a very large and vibrant audience around the world who wants great journalism, who's willing to pay for it, who are happy to see ads when those ads are respectful of the user experience. And so what we've tried to do with Flipboard is create an experience where if you want to learn more about your industry, your craft, your work, if you want to learn how to be a better parent, a better citizen, if you want to just learn more about mountain biking or camping or backpacking, Flipboard is a great place to go to get that content and those products curated by people who share your passion. And so over time, we're getting more and more people to come to invest in their own life and make their own life better, whereas a lot of the other social media platforms are really about watching other people's lives go by. You're connecting with your friends and family, which can be great, but in the end, you're really looking at other people's lives. There does need to be a place where you can turn to invest in your own life and share things that you're passionate about with other people who you share a passion with. And that's really what Flipboard is all about. So it's a very different approach than the other social media platforms.
Sure. So Tony, if you could talk a bit more about when you're looking holistically at all the platforms that the sun is on right now, what do you think is working right now, and where do you think what's not working when you think about everywhere that you're distributed?
Well, I think what's demonstrably not working in the United Kingdom is the way that the digital advertising market has broken down. It's grown, the latest figures I've seen indicate the digital advertising market has grown from £4 billion in 2010 to £10 billion in 2016. But newspapers, the share that they have taken has grown from only £100 million to £250 million. So it's the advertising sales thing that we're most concerned, I would have thought about. Of course, given that Facebook and Google are consuming 80% of the digital advertising market, and I think 90% of the incremental increase, it means that the rest of us, the national, the regional publishers, are fighting for pennies when it's left over. That is probably our number one issue. So for all the traffic that we've got, and we've got the second largest newspaper site in the United Kingdom, the money is not following the traffic for us or indeed any other national newspaper website in the UK.
Sure. And we were talking backstage about how a lot of the newspapers in the UK talk to each other and about what's going right, what's not. What else are you hearing from your counterparts at the other publications? It seems to be kind of a trend, like a regional trend. I mean, we're seeing it in the States as well, but if you could talk a little bit more holistically about what else you're hearing.
Well, I think, I can't speak for other publishers, but I think the national newspaper market is very competitive in the UK, and the sense I have is that we're all in the same boat. If all the traffic came to us directly on our platform, I think us and everybody else would be able to fund our journalism. But the fact it's coming to us via intermediaries is making it very, very difficult. Not everybody's going to survive this in the next few years. I think our market is probably healthier in print terms than the United States, and the reading habit in print is probably more deeply ingrained. But the structural problems that you have in the United States, we also have in the United Kingdom, and people are going to lose and depart the market as a result.
Sure. So, Mike, how many of the publishers that are coming to you now are, because obviously you guys have been around for what, like 5, 6, 7 years now?
That's 7 years.
7 years, yeah. So how has that changed in terms of the type of publishers that are coming to the platform? Because it's interesting because you guys, and I think the only other, at least I can think of, the only other major online platform is Snapchat in terms of not using an algorithm. And so I'm kind of curious, is this something you're seeing too? There's an appetite amongst publishers to get away from this mysterious engineering feat, or does that ring a bell with anybody?
Well, yeah, I think that we use algorithms, but we use them in service to our editors. Our editors are in control of the algorithms, and they use them to help discover great content that we can feature to our audiences. And algorithms are used to personalize content as well. But the way we think about the algorithms is we apply these editorial standards to them. So the editors at Flipboard will design the algorithms collaboratively with the engineers, where the editors can control the inputs, they can monitor the outputs, they can have levers and controls to dial things in and out to make sure that we're getting the right diverse collection of sources, that the sources are high quality, there's no fake news, and that takes human judgment. It takes trained professionals to create that kind of environment. Now, we wouldn't be able to scale that globally. We're in 26 regions around the world if we didn't use algorithms. There's 1 trillion pieces of content created every day on the internet. You need algorithms, but they have to work in service to the public good and to the editors and to the audiences, not the other way around. And that's a very different approach, and I think something that the industry broadly needs to figure out better.
Sure. So on that note, so you mentioned that you have editors in-house that are working with these algorithms, but it seems like across the board, across all these platforms, are often in-house editors working with an in-house team with, I'm sure, varying degrees of communication with the publishers that you're working with. So I'm kind of curious, for both of you, does there need to be more knowledge or cross-pollination between, let's say, like an editorial team at The Sun or anywhere else, talking with the teams developing the algorithms at Facebook and Google and Flipboard and Twitter to better understand how these are actually, when they do a tweak, Facebook's notorious for touting one thing and then a few months later kind of downplaying it. And so I'm kind of curious, does there need to be more cross-pollination? And do you think that that is something that's viable that both platforms and publishers would be along with?
I think there definitely needs to be more cross-pollination because at the moment, I think it's a one-way conversation. There's a collapse in traffic for some reason. You're assured that the algorithm hasn't changed. The traffic gradually comes back or it spikes again up. And you are really never any the wiser about why it happened other than you're doing the same stuff every day, what's gone wrong. It has to be an algorithm change. And at the moment, that's a one-way conversation. I think truthfully, and I don't wish to include Facebook, I don't wish to include Flipboard in this, which I think Flipboard is magnificent. We're working very closely with Snapchat, but the giant platforms I'm talking about, I don't really think at the moment they understand, or they want to understand the cost of journalism, how expensive it is to produce. They're either willfully ignorant or it just doesn't suit their purposes, and they'll wind up downplaying journalism in future.
And I think that it's incumbent upon these platforms to partner very closely editorially with the publishers. It's their content, they're the experts, they know how best to attract audiences, how to package their content, and I think it's the job of the platforms to provide the tools to the publishers, the transparency to the publishers. They should have access to all the data around their content. It's their content. That's just I think a first principle that needs to be followed. And by the way, in terms of collaboration, I think it's actually quite important right now to figure out ways to have transparency around some of these key algorithms. I think that creating some kind of an open source approach, some sort of model where algorithms don't have the same kind of black box sort of model that they have today, is going to end up being pretty important to create a fair and level playing field around the world for good journalism. And I think if we don't do that, we're going to continue to have problems, both in those algorithms being gamed in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways, and in having journalists and publishers continue to struggle with the kinds of questions that Tony's talking about.
Yeah. So Tony, when you're thinking about the conversations that you've had with the platforms, you mentioned a few minutes ago that they maybe don't understand how much it costs to create good journalism these days. I'm kind of curious, how often do those conversations happen, and do you think that they don't understand, or do you think that maybe they just don't actually care about the revenue that publishers are getting?
I think it's fair to say that they care about their own bottom line, and we're only a small part of their ecosystem. So I think, and I'm sure that's an experience shared by every UK publisher, that we're just a small part of their empire, and we will shout and moan, but we really don't resonate. I mean, to come to Mike's point about data, it's a really good example of it, because our inability to get data, which would be very valuable to us, that data is hoarded by those big companies, Facebook and Google in particular, who we shouldn't forget, they are the two most powerful news publishers in history. And the data that we get from those big companies, there's a great paucity of it. It's really not much use to it. It's hoarded very carefully by the big companies.
Yeah. So it's like they take in all the data from these publishers and who's reading things, but then they don't actually give it back.
Correct.
Yeah. So if you could talk a bit more about what does it look like? What kind of data would you like to see that you're not seeing right now?
Well, it's undoubtedly the case that the news industry hasn't done the most brilliant job of knowing more about its users, and we're all trying to get much closer to our users. But it's basic things, the length of time that they're on your site, email addresses, the way they navigate around your site. It's almost everything. There's very few of them are willing to share the kind of data that you can then turn into money further down the road. As I say, I don't think we've been the best ourselves at harvesting data, but we've certainly not been helped in our cause by those big platforms. And by the way, we shouldn't forget the role of ad tech in all of this as well, because audiences are now being bought in their millions from behind trading desks. So high volume stories are being prioritized over the big production numbers, the Paradise Papers, and that's an element of this too. Undoubtedly, much more. If we had much more human interaction, we'd be in a better place.
So on that note, I know we've talked a lot about Google and Facebook and Flipboard and Twitter, but then there's also other content recommendation engines like Taboola and Outbrain. I'm kind of curious, where do you guys see those fitting into this overall ecosystem of content and advertising?
Well, I think they're pretty dangerous right now, and it's kind of a shame. Now, the people who created, I know the CEO of Outbrain, he's an incredibly good guy, Yaron, and he tells me that, the publishers tune the algorithms to get the most revenue. And whatever the rationale is, when you go to these sites, these incredible journalistic sites, and then you scroll to the bottom of the page and you see toe fungus and human growth hormone and fake news. It's very depressing, and I think it's a real problem for the web. We're here at Web Summit. To me, this is it's not a good thing for the web. I don't know, Tony. How do you feel about it?
Well, we definitely want to wean ourselves off these for precisely that reason. It's a very poor experience if you come to the end of the site and you see these weird and wacky stories. I can't imagine, although they're providing income, I can't imagine there's a single publisher who's comfortable with the sort of stuff that these sites throw up. And it's a very bad user experience. And I think sooner or later we're going to have to wean ourselves off them. They're like crack cocaine because they're providing money, but they're not good for the overall user experience. And why should anybody come back to your site?
Well, here's why, by the way, I would say that it's so important for technology and journalists to coordinate and collaborate. I just don't think technologists have bad intentions here. They just don't understand the world of journalism. They don't understand how publishers invest all this money to create these incredibly important stories and then have all of that just stolen away from them. So they do it with the right intentions. The web was built with those same intentions, free, ability to see all this amazing content. But without really understanding the ecosystem and creating an environment that's respectful of the user experience and respectful of the content, and by the way, also respectful of the brands and their creative, we're going to continue to be stuck in this problem. I do think that there are publishers that are starting to figure this out. I think there are technologies on the horizon like programmatic that can actually be used for good and can actually be, if properly utilized, will allow publishers to band together to collect audiences into premium private marketplaces where they can restrict access to, only the best advertisers can be there, and share data and audiences together and start to rival other social media platforms in terms of scale. So I think that there is an overall need for publishers to understand the technology and for technologists to understand publishers, and I think there's more work to be done there.
That's undoubtedly the case. I mean, it's also the case that because newspapers, certainly in the UK, are subject to very strict regulatory rules, very strict laws of the land, and it's enormously frustrating to us, to come to your point about not understanding what we do, that by comparison, the platforms are not subject to any of those rules and restrictions, and we suffer a criminal disadvantage because of it.
So one last question
That's a
here.
great point.
I'm kind of curious, thinking about that, right? There's a need for more understanding across both sides. But as we saw earlier this spring with fake news across all these platforms and brand safety, with brands popping up against terroristic content on YouTube, we saw P&G and other advertisers pull their advertising away until things were fixed. So obviously there's eyeballs in all these platforms, but why don't publishers band together to boycott these platforms, just as advertisers did to boycott the platforms? Like, what would that look like? Is it just that if there's no incentive for the companies to change, like the platforms, what will make them to change? Why not just boycott them altogether until something is fixed?
Well, I think that's easier said than done. The duopoly are so dominant that it's very, very hard to walk away from them and decide you want nothing to do with them whatsoever. And I think it's also the case that for all the hoo-ha about brand safety and terrible content that was found, whether it's ISIS related or what have you, on Facebook and Google, they've made the tiniest of dents in their overall. They may have damaged their reputation, but in terms of their overall profitability, they haven't damaged any of that whatsoever. And there's an awful lot of that content still out there, despite their best efforts. But there's no interest in them, I think, necessarily cleaning up their act while they're making such an awful lot of profit.
Any last thoughts?
Well, I think that there's not a very good alternative. You can't walk away from all those audiences and that revenue so easily. You need to have an alternative. Now, I do think that some of these opportunities with programmatic. Let me give you an example. Concert is a premium private marketplace for quality brands and quality publishers. Condé Nast, Comcast, Vox, and Flipboard is a part of that. And we share audiences, we share inventory, and we enable basically an experience an experience that's premium. And effectively, those publishers now can claim the same kind of scale in the United States as Facebook has, which is pretty cool. So it takes that off the table and creates an alternative, and potentially does allow the publishers to be more willing to walk away from platforms that they don't feel where they're being treated fairly. But those alternatives have to be developed still. They're still nascent, and I also think that there will be a new collection of platforms. There's always newcomers, and hopefully those newcomers will understand some of these problems and be able to work with publishers more effectively and create some alternatives.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. But thanks to you both.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.